700 tons of explosives, not 700 kilograms. Tons. That is the quantity Israeli combat engineers carried piece by piece into a single mountain in southern Lebanon before they set it off. And when it went, the ground moved for kilometers in every direction. But the blast is the least interesting part of this story. What matters is what was sitting inside that mountain, how long it had been there, why it took years to find, and what its destruction does and does not change for the families living on the other side of that border. I'm Pinto, reporting for TBN Israel, and this is your ground report. No noise, no spin. Just what we know, what we can verify, and what happens when a war stops being fought on the surface and starts being fought inside the rock. Start with the geography, because the geography explains everything. The site was carved beneath the Beaufort Ridge. This is not an anonymous hill somewhere in the Lebanese countryside. It has dominated this frontier for centuries, and the reason is simple. It looks straight down on the approaches into Israel's Galilee. It sits roughly 6 kilometers from Israel's northernmost town. Whoever stands on that ridge sees Israeli territory with the naked eye. Hezbollah understood that. So did Iran. And for close to 20 years, they turned the stone underneath it into a military installation designed to survive a war, fight a war, and still be standing when the war ended. This was not a bunker where a few fighters wait out an airstrike. It was a multi-level network cut deep into solid rock, with enough capacity to keep hundreds of terrorists underground for long stretches without ever coming up for air. Sleeping quarters, kitchens, showers, medical facilities, independent water and electricity, storage rooms built specifically for anti-tank missiles, firing positions oriented at aircraft and drones overhead. One tunnel inside the complex ran more than a kilometer into the mountain in a single line. From in there, Hezbollah could observe northern Israel, coordinate attacks, send up drones, fire anti-tank missiles, shelter its commanders, and preserve its manpower, all while Israeli aircraft owned the sky above and saw almost none of it. That is the entire logic of subterranean warfare. It splits one battlefield into two. There's the war you can see, and there's the war underneath it. Israel can destroy a launcher, level a building, seize a road, and none of it reaches the second war. The fighters are still down there with food, power, ammunition, communications, and usually more than one way out. You can win the visible war completely and never touch the real one. Now hold the scale of this in your head, because the scale is the tell. Nobody dug this in a season. It was expanded gradually, section by section, over close to 2 decades, deliberately built so that no single strike could bring the whole thing down at once. Junctions were reinforced. Entrances were spread across the ridge, several of them camouflaged to pass as natural rock. Or ordinary farm structures. Ventilation shafts were engineered to keep air moving for hundreds of people living below ground for extended periods. Construction like that requires money, engineering knowledge, and patience. A local militia does not produce that alone. It comes from a state sponsor with resources and a long horizon. Someone building for a war that has not started yet. Which raises the obvious problem. How do you fight something that was purpose-built to hide from you? You send machines in first. Combat engineering units push drones into spaces no soldier should enter blind. Inside one of these tunnels, Hezbollah operatives opened fire on an Israeli drone and then pulled back deeper into the darkness, trying to vanish into their own network. They were tracked. Additional operatives attempting to slip out through other exits were identified. Ground forces followed the movement in real time and handed the picture up to the Air Force. The terrorists were eliminated from the air, in a strike guided by intelligence collected underground. And when Israeli troops finally went into the tunnel themselves, they found the thing Northern Command had suspected for years: mortar rounds, fragmentation grenades, RPG launchers, Kornet anti-tank missiles, among the most lethal weapons in Hezbollah's inventory, anti-aircraft machine guns, stockpiles of AK-47 rifles. That inventory answers a question people often argue about. A shelter is stocked to keep people alive. This was stocked to project force. It was a forward operating base, positioned and armed to support an offensive into the Galilee against Israeli civilian communities a few kilometers away. At the end of July, Israel decided the site would not be sealed, monitored, or reused. It would be erased. That took weeks. Engineers moved roughly 700 tons of explosive material through the complex and placed it across multiple levels, a job that demanded precision at every step, while Israeli forces held the ridge above them and worked around the historic Beaufort Castle, still standing on the summit, a fortification that has looked out over this same ground since the era of the Crusades. Then they detonated it. A network Hezbollah. Spent nearly 20 years building came down. The ground above the mountain shook. Dust vented out of openings across the ridge that Israeli forces had not known existed. The blast pressure found them and revealed them. Engineers on site described it as one of the largest single demolition operations of its kind carried out in this war. Think about what that phrase actually means. Not the yield of one missile. Tons of explosives hauled by hand and by vehicle across terrain still classified as hostile. Here is the part most coverage skipped. The explosion did not end the threat. It ended one site. Northern command officers have said this plainly in their own assessments. Additional strategic underground positions still exist. Across southern Lebanon, including sites Israeli forces have not reached and may not have fully mapped. Nobody in uniform is describing the Beaufort demolition as the end of anything, and underneath that concern sits a second one that is harder to solve. Israeli officers doubt the Lebanese armed forces currently possess the intelligence capability, the freedom of action, or the specialized engineering expertise to locate and dismantle networks like this on their own, even assuming the political will exists. That doubt is now the central obstacle, because this fight has moved from the tunnels to a negotiating table. Israeli and Lebanese teams are expected back in Rome for another round of American-mediated talks. The goal is to expand what is being called the pilot zone process, created under the framework agreement reached in late June. On paper, it reads cleanly. Israeli troops pull back from a defined area. The Lebanese army moves in. Hezbollah fighters, weapons, launchers, and tunnels inside that zone are removed. A verification mechanism confirms the area is genuinely clear. Then the process expands to the next cluster of villages. The first pilot operations began in Faroun, Sharifa, and Zar al-Ghariya. Lebanese soldiers deployed into those areas. Israel adjusted some of its positions in response. That is a real test of whether the model functions in the physical world rather than in a document. It is also a fragile one. The reason to start small is that a pilot builds a record, village by village, instead of gambling everything on one sweeping agreement that can die in a week. If Lebanese forces demonstrate in these first villages that they will search houses, seize weapons, and hold the ground without Hezbollah quietly filtering back within a month, that is evidence the framework can scale across dozens of towns in the south. If the fighters simply disappear while observers are present and reappear the moment attention shifts, that failure will be visible almost immediately, and it will make every subsequent round of talks harder to sell to an Israeli public that has watched this exact sequence before. Now think about what verification requires in practice, because this is where the diplomatic language starts to strain. A soldier at a checkpoint can confirm that a flag no longer flies over a rooftop. He cannot confirm that a sealed room behind a residential wall is empty of missiles. He cannot know whether a shaft under a private garage connects to an exit outside the village entirely. He cannot establish that the man walking past him in civilian clothes is not an elite Hezbollah commando waiting on orders. So the disagreement is not really about lines on a map. It is about authority. Who may search private property? What happens when access is refused? Who is empowered to declare that a tunnel has been destroyed rather than temporarily closed with another entrance left intact somewhere over the hill? And the hardest one of all, what mechanism exists if weapons quietly return after Israeli forces have already withdrawn and moved on to the next sector? Layered on top of that is trust, and trust here has been eroding for decades. Israel has watched the rebuild pattern before. After previous ceasefires, the sequence repeated almost identically. Fighters step out of public view, weapons shift back from the border, and construction resumes underground once international attention drifts elsewhere. That history is exactly why Israeli officers refuse to treat a single pilot zone as a turning point. A verification regime is only as strong as the willingness to enforce it when a violation is found. Lebanon's internal politics make that far from certain. Hezbollah is not only an armed organization inside Lebanon, it holds seats in parliament and significant influence over state institutions, which forces an uncomfortable question about how independently the Lebanese army can act against a movement woven into the government it serves. Hezbollah has already publicly rejected full disarmament. Its leadership insists Israeli forces must withdraw completely before any serious discussion of weapons can even begin. Israel's position is the mirror image. A withdrawal cannot function as an invitation to rebuild everything that was just destroyed. The American approach is to break that deadlock incrementally, one village at a time instead of one grand bargain. And the Beaufort network is the clearest possible illustration of why that is so difficult. An agreement can be drafted, negotiated, and signed in weeks. A military system built over 20 years inside solid rock is a different category of problem. Finding it is hard. Proving it is gone is harder. To understand why it existed at all, you have to look past Lebanon. Iran did not finance this to defend Lebanese soil. Iran built Hezbollah into a forward military arm pointed at Israel, a capability that could be switched on the moment Iran itself came under pressure. The design was regional: Hamas in Gaza, Iranian-backed militias in Iraq, the Houthis in Yemen. Multiple fronts opening around Israel simultaneously, forcing Israeli forces to fight in several directions at once. Within that architecture, Hezbollah was the most dangerous piece, the largest arsenal, the most extensively trained fighters, precision-guided weapons, an active drone program, dedicated anti-tank teams, and the Radwan force, trained and positioned specifically for a ground incursion into Israeli communities along this very border. The Beaufort complex was one physical component of that plan. The logic behind it was never hidden from anyone who studies the region. A direct war launched from Iranian territory exposes Iran to direct retaliation. A war launched from Lebanese mountains, Gazan tunnels, Iraqi bases, and Yemeni launch sites lets Iran bleed Israel from several directions, while keeping its own ground far from the fighting. Hezbollah was always meant to be the centerpiece, closest to Israeli population centers, most heavily armed, and given the most time to prepare. Everything found beneath that ridge matches that level of investment exactly. Israel has now pushed Hezbollah meaningfully back from the immediate border. Israeli forces hold key strategic terrain, senior terror commanders have been eliminated, and a substantial amount of underground infrastructure across the south has been dismantled. But military gains only become permanent when the enemy cannot quietly walk back in after the units have moved on. That is the unresolved question sitting over the Rome talks right now. So what does any of this mean for the people who actually live on this line? For a family in northern Israel, a cleared ridge is not a reason to unpack. A farmer does not plant a new orchard because a document was signed in a conference room on another continent. People come home when they believe the road stays open, when their children can sit in a classroom and feel safe there, when workers can finish an entire growing season uninterrupted, and when a single afternoon cannot wipe out years of investment. That is why this story runs directly into places like Metula and Malia along the same frontier. Some of these communities are close enough that residents see Lebanese territory from their own yards. During the war, orchards and vineyards were damaged by rocket fire. Reaching the fields became genuinely dangerous. Workers left. Whole seasons were lost. A demolition on a ridge kilometers away does not, by itself, put anyone back. In those houses or fruit back on those branches, a road can be repaired in days. An apple orchard runs on an entirely different clock. Young trees need years to survive heat, cold, pests, broken irrigation, and labor shortages before they yield a commercial crop. Rebuilding a farm on this border is a multi-year commitment made long after the cameras leave. Talk to farmers here and you hear the same thing repeatedly. It is not the damage from one rocket that empties a village permanently. Fences get rebuilt, burned fields get replanted. What drives people away for good is uncertainty, the quiet expectation that the next round is only a matter of time, and that pouring years of work into land you may be evacuated from again is not worth the risk. Breaking that cycle is harder than collapsing any tunnel because it demands consistency over years rather than one operation over one weekend, which is why agriculture is treated here as part of border security. These farms sit on the line itself. The IDF can deny an enemy a firing position by force. It is the farmers, the workers, the schools, and the families who make an Israeli presence on this land permanent. Without jobs, returning is temporary. Without agriculture, large parts of the northern economy cannot recover. Without people actually living there, a military achievement never connects to civilian life. That is the reason the Rebuild Israel campaign exists, bringing life back to communities along this exact border that were marked by war, displacement, and loss. Because a victory on a distant ridge means very little if the people it was won for never come home to live in the quiet it produced. Planting an apple orchard here is a physical commitment to restore livelihoods and strengthen Israel's future. Putting a tree in this ground is a statement that the people of Israel intend to stay. It rebuilds what was damaged, creates work for local families, helps displaced communities return, and turns scarred land back into land that produces life. When you give to this campaign, your support puts real trees into real soil and helps restore the economy growing around them. It is not a gesture for one day. It is a commitment measured in years, and God willing, in fruit for generations. Of families who choose to remain on this land, stand with Israel today, plant hope, help restore the North. Go to tbn.org/rebuild Israel. Again, that's tbn.org/rebuild Israel. You can also give it directly by calling the number listed with this report. We build the land, we restore hope, and we bless the future together, and help us get the truth out of Israel. Like this report, share it, and subscribe so more people can follow what is actually happening on the ground while it is still unfolding. What you see in one video is a fraction of a much larger story. For first-hand reports, behind-the-scenes moments, and stories of faith and resilience straight from Israel, go to tbn.org, Josh's Journeys, Josh Boots. Again, tbn.org, Josh Journeys, Josh Boots. You can also text the word BOOTS to 316316 for direct updates from our team here. So here is where we stand. Israel has struck into the underground army Hezbollah spent 2 decades building beneath this border. 700 tons of explosives collapsed one system in seconds. But the north becomes secure only when that threat is kept out permanently, and only when Israeli families feel safe enough to come home and stay. Which leaves one question worth watching. Will the next chapter of this story be measured by another tunnel uncovered somewhere under Lebanon, or by the first full harvest coming off this land again? Keep following the reporting, and subscribe to the TBN Israel YouTube channel so you don't miss the next update from the ground. And please pray over this. Pray for wisdom for the leaders making these decisions, for the IDF troops still holding this border tonight, and for the ordinary families who simply want to live here freely and securely, with a future in front of them. This has been your ground report from Israel's northern border. I'm Pinto for TBN Israel, and we will stay with this story, from the tunnels under Beaufort to the orchards growing back above them, until both chapters reach their end.